November 16th, 1951. Morning fog lifts off Portsmouth Harbor as Captain Dennis Campbell walks up the gangway to HMS Illustrious. In his briefcase is a single sheet of paper, a diagram so simple a child could sketch it. A flight deck angled 10 degrees to port. Nothing about it looks revolutionary. What Campbell doesn't know is that within 18 months, this drawing will save more naval aviators' lives than any weapon system ever built. What he does know is terrifying. In the previous 12 months alone, the Royal Navy has lost 43 aircraft to landing accidents, 43 machines destroyed, 17 pilots killed, dozens more maimed. Every one of those losses happened in the final 30 seconds of flight, that desperate moment when a 30-ton jet traveling 140 miles per hour must grab an arresting wire on a pitching deck, while a steel crash barricade waits 60 feet ahead, ready to shred any aircraft that misses. The Americans face even worse statistics. In 1951, U.S. Navy carrier aviation suffered 776 Class A mishaps, accidents involving death or total aircraft loss, more than 2 per day in peacetime. The Korean War only magnified the carnage. USS Boxer recorded 7 barrier crashes in a single deployment. USS Princeton lost 9 aircraft in 4 weeks. On straight-deck carriers, missing the wires meant only one outcome: slamming into the barricade at full power or plowing into the aircraft parked forward, producing a fireball capable of killing a dozen men in seconds. The jet age had arrived, but carrier aviation hadn't caught up. The F-9F Panther landed 40 knots faster than prop-driven fighters like the Hellcat. Its engines needed 7 seconds to spool from idle to full thrust, an eternity when sinking toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers stood on the port quarter, waving paddles frantically, but by the time a pilot realized he was high, low, or fast, physics had already sealed his fate. Every admiral, engineer, and test pilot knew the truth. Carrier aviation had reached a breaking point. Jets were the future, but the future meant nothing if the present was killing aviators. What Campbell doesn't know, what no one in that Portsmouth meeting room knows, is that his radical idea will be rejected, mocked, and called impossible by the very experts tasked with solving impossible problems, and that the breakthrough will not come from committees or wind tunnels, but from one man's refusal to accept that good men should die because of a design flaw. The problem began in 1945 when Lieutenant Commander William P. Leonard made the first jet landing aboard USS Wake Island. His FR-1 Fireball touched down at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than any piston fighter, and the arresting cable screamed as they absorbed the kinetic shock. The landing succeeded. The warning signs were ignored. By 1950, every major navy was facing the same crisis. Jets revolutionized speed and altitude, but their slow throttle response created a lethal trap. Propeller aircraft could chop throttle on the landing signal officer's cut signal and simply drop onto the deck. Jets couldn't. They had to land power on, maintaining thrust until touchdown because their engines took too long to accelerate if a go-around was needed. This created a nightmare scenario. Pilots flew final approach with engines spooled up, committed to landing, and unable to climb quickly if they missed the wires. On a straight-deck carrier, 4 arresting wires stretched across 60 feet of deck. Behind them was the crash barricade, a steel cable web meant to catch missed landings. Behind that sat rows of parked aircraft, fuel trucks, ammunition carts, everything required to keep a carrier fighting. The math was brutal. A Panther landing at 125 knots covered 211 feet per second. If a pilot missed all 4 wires, he had only 2.1 seconds before slamming into the barricade. Sometimes the barricade worked. When it failed, 30 tons of fuel and ordnance tore forward at 100 miles per hour into the parked aircraft. Captain Bruce Williams, Air Operations Officer on USS Kearsarge, watched 11 men die when a barrier failed in March 1951. The accident report reads, "Aircraft struck barrier at full power. Barrier separated. Aircraft continued forward into 6 Corsairs. Resulting fire reached aviation gasoline stores. 14 aircraft destroyed. 11 personnel killed, 23 injured. Carrier operations suspended 48 hours. The solution everyone focused on was stronger barriers. The British attempted the flex deck, a rubberized surface meant to catch jets without landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown made 40 landings on the system at Farnborough. In official reports, he called it fundamentally sound. To friends, he called it bloody terrifying. The Americans developed stronger, heavier crash barriers. The Bureau of Aeronautics spent $3.2 million creating the Davis barrier system, a mechanical web capable of stopping a 25,000-pound jet at full throttle. When it worked, it impressed. When it failed, the devastation was absolute. But stronger barriers didn't prevent crashes. They merely tried to contain them. Every senior aviator understood the real problem: the flight deck itself.
Reshaped, head of aviation military characteristics in the Office of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, wrote in June 1945, "Current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics." In plain terms, carriers were designed for propeller aircraft that could land at 70 knots and abort an approach instantly. Jets landed at 130 knots and couldn't abort. They were trying to land 1952 aircraft on 1942 ships, and people would continue dying until the system changed. Everyone agreed on the problem. No one could solve it. The British tried the flex deck. The Americans tried stronger barriers, backup barriers, emergency nets. The French tried reducing aircraft weight. Nothing worked. The accident rate only climbed. What they needed was someone bold or reckless enough to question the one assumption nobody ever questioned. Why does the landing area have to be parallel to the ship's axis? What they needed was Dennis Campbell. Captain Dennis Royal Farson Campbell was never supposed to solve anything. He was a bureaucrat. Born November 13, 1907 in South Sea, England, Campbell entered the Royal Navy in 1925 as a midshipman and qualified as a pilot in 1931, early enough to fly fabric and wood biplanes, late enough to understand that naval aviation had evolved from a gentleman's pastime into a discipline requiring engineering precision. During World War II, he flew Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, obsolete aircraft that nevertheless crippled the Bismarck. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross. No one called him brilliant. No one called him a visionary. After the war, the Admiralty assigned him to the Ministry of Supply as the Deputy Chief RN Representative, a desk job overseeing liaison between naval officers and civilian contractors. He had no engineering degrees, no technical credentials. His life was paperwork, development schedules, coordination meetings, requisition forms. But Dennis Campbell possessed one trait no credential could guarantee. He could not ignore dead pilots. In 1951, he attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael or Mick Lithgow, a test pilot killed when his jet hit the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been his student, just 23 years old. His approach had been perfect, his airspeed perfect, but he floated 6 feet too far, missed the wires, and hit a barricade that failed. The aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Campbell stood at that graveside and later told his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is insane. We're killing them with our own equipment. A pilot can do everything right and still die because 60 feet isn't enough margin for error. There has to be another way." Goodhart assumed it was grief-talking. Officers say things like that at funerals. But Campbell couldn't let it go. He pulled accident reports. He interviewed landing signal officers. He studied approach patterns. He wasn't an engineer, so he did what non-engineers do. He drew. The breakthrough came on a train ride from Portsmouth to London. Campbell sketched carrier decks in his notebook, trying to find pilots more room. If he couldn't make the landing area longer, he could make it wider. If he couldn't make it wider because a ship's beam was fixed, then he could angle it. Angle it. He drew a flight deck canted 10 degrees to port. With that angle, the landing area no longer ended at a steel barricade. It ended in open ocean. A pilot who missed the arresting wires could push the throttle forward, climb away, and try again. No barricade, no parked aircraft, no catastrophic collisions. Just air, water, and a second chance. The idea was so simple it felt ridiculous, meaning it was either genius or something so obvious that real engineers had already disproved it. On August 7, 1951, Campbell convened a meeting at the Ministry of Supply. Present were Louis Boddington, Director of the Naval Air Department at Farnborough, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, and 6 senior aviation engineers. Campbell opened his briefcase and showed them his sketch. The room erupted. That is completely illegal. Commander James, Senior Flight Operations Specialist, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words struck with the authority of natural law. What you're proposing violates an international air navigation convention written after 15 years of carrier experience. This isn't innovation, Captain. It's amateur nonsense. Campbell had expected pushback. He had not expected contempt. James continued, "You're asking pilots to land across the ship's natural motion. Carriers pitch and roll around their keel. An angled deck means pilots approach at an angle to that motion. They'll be fighting drift constantly. The landing area will move unpredictably under them. You'll increase crashes, not reduce them." Lieutenant Goodhart tried to answer, but Louis Boddington, the civilian engineer from Farnborough, raised his hand. "Show me the math." James blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The math," Boddington repeated. "You say pilots will fight drift, then calculate it. An 8-degree deck on a ship rolling 12 degrees. What's the differential drift across a 30-second approach?" Silence. Boddington looked around the room. "Anyone?" No one spoke. "Then we test it," Boddington said at last. "Captain Campbell, Farnborough has a painted outline runway. We can paint an angled deck outline on HMS Triumph. In 1 week, we'll run simulated touch-and-go approaches. If the drift problem is real, we'll measure it. If it's theoretical catastrophizing, we'll learn that too." Rear Admiral Slattery leaned back. "Louis, you understand that if you paint an angled deck on Triumph and pilots start crashing, you're ending both your career and Captain Campbell's." "Noted, sir," Boddington replied. "And if it works?" the Admiral asked. Boddington smiled. "Then we stop killing pilots who did everything right." Testing began in September 1951. HMS Triumph left Portsmouth with a white-painted angled deck outline across her axial flight deck. Not a structural change, just paint. For 3 weeks, Navy pilots flew touch-and-go approaches, treating the painted line as if it were the real deck edge.
The drift issue everyone had predicted simply never appeared. Pilots adjusted in just 2 landings. What they discovered instead was a kind of freedom they had never experienced on a carrier. Lieutenant Peter Chilton, one of the test pilots, later wrote that during one approach, he came in too high, floated past every arresting wire, and, for the first time in his flying career, didn't feel terror. He pushed the throttle forward, climbed away, and reset his approach. There was no barrier waiting to destroy his aircraft, no parked planes to plow into, only empty air and a second chance. He said it felt as if someone had handed him his life back. By October, the painted deck trials had proved beyond question that the concept worked. But the real challenge still lay ahead, convincing the rest of the world. HMS Triumph was a British ship, but the Navy facing the most catastrophic landing losses wasn't the Royal Navy. It was the United States Navy. And the U.S. Navy was not known for accepting that British officers had better ideas about how to land airplanes on American carriers. On September 14, 1951, at the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown stood before 40 American test pilots. Every man in the room silently weighed whether they could trust him. Brown was the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, the man who had landed more different aircraft types than anyone in history, holder of every British naval aviation record.
None of that mattered now, because he was about to tell U.S. aviators that their carriers, the heart of American naval power, were designed incorrectly. "Gentlemen," Brown began, "in the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade?" 7 hands went up, then 12, then 15. "How many of you know someone who was killed hitting the barricade?" Every hand rose. Brown opened his briefcase. "I want to show you something the Royal Navy has been testing. It's going to sound insane, but I've made 63 landings on it, and I'm standing here instead of being scraped off a deck. So I'm asking you to hear me out." He pinned Campbell's sketch to the wall, an aircraft carrier with its landing area angled 8 degrees to port. The room erupted instantly. "You want us landing sideways? The LSO won't be able to judge the approach. You've put the landing zone closer to the island. You'll hit the superstructure." Brown waited until the shouting died down. "Every concern you just raised, we had every one of them. Then we tested it. And here's what we found. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you don't die. You add throttle and go around. That's it." Commander Harold Buell, the commanding officer of VF-84, stood up. "Commander Brown, I've been landing on carrier since 1943. What you're describing contradicts every principle we learned in 8 years of combat. You're asking us to abandon proven doctrine for a British experiment." "I'm asking you," Brown replied, "to stop dying because of a design flaw." The room fell silent. "You're landing jets on straight decks because that's what you've always had. But straight decks were designed for Corsairs and Hellcats, planes that could chop throttle and drop onto the deck. Jets can't do that. So you're forcing 1952 aircraft into 1942 procedures, and your people are dying because of it. The angled deck doesn't break doctrine. It updates the ship to match the airplane." Rear Admiral Apollo Sosek, the senior U.S. naval aviator stationed in London, stepped forward. "I observed the trials on Triumph. Commander Brown is right. The concept works. I've recommended that we test it on USS Midway." But Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, head of the Bureau of Aeronautics, shook his head. "We're already testing solutions. The Davis barrier has a 98.7% success rate." "98.7% of what?" Brown interrupted. "Of the aircraft that actually hit it? What about the pilots who never make it that far because they panic at the sight of it? What about the ones who deliberately ditch in the ocean rather than risk hitting a barricade at full power? Your statistic measures how well the barrier performs. It doesn't measure how many pilots survive the approach." The room exploded again, half the pilots nodding, the other half furious. Admiral Sosek raised his voice. "Gentlemen, enough. We will run angled deck tests on USS Midway. Painted outlines only, simulated landings. If it works, we structurally convert one carrier. If it fails, we bury the idea. But we will not continue losing aviators to something we can test right now. Is that clear?" Admiral Pride stood for 10 silent seconds. "USS Midway trials authorized. But if this British fantasy causes even one extra casualty, I will kill the program and anyone associated with it." Sosek nodded. "Agreed." The meeting ended. Brown closed his briefcase, fully aware he had just risked his career on nothing more than a painted line on a flight deck. What he didn't know yet was that within 90 days, that painted line on USS Midway would perform so flawlessly that the U.S. Navy would rebuild USS Antietam into the first true angled deck carrier in world history. If you're fascinated by the moments when one person's courage reshapes history, make sure you subscribe, because what happened next when the first pilot landed on Antietam's new angled deck changed naval warfare forever. But first, January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Lieutenant Commander Hal Buell brings his F-9 F-5 Panther into the landing pattern behind USS Antietam. This is his 43rd carrier landing, but his first on a real angled deck. Not paint this time, but a welded steel sponson jutting 8 degrees from the port side. Buell doesn't trust it. His entire career, survival meant hit the wires or hit the barricade. That fear had saved his life twice. Now he had to unlearn it. He drops his landing gear, trims the aircraft, calls the ball. "Panther ball 3.2. "Roger ball," the LSO replies. His approach is perfect,
until a gust of wind lifts him 6 feet high. On a straight deck, the LSO would wave him off immediately. Buell would have to climb away, burn more fuel, and try again. But today, the LSO says nothing. Because on an angled deck, being a little high doesn't kill you. It's something you can correct. Buell lowers his nose, loses the excess altitude, but now he's long. He's going to miss the wires. On a straight deck, this is the moment pilots panic, yank the aircraft into a dangerous correction, and crash. Instead, Buell forces himself to follow the briefing. If you miss the wires, just climb. The deck is clear. Trust it. His wheels hit the deck and bounce. His tail hook skips the 1-wire, the 2-wire, the 3-wire, the 4-wire. He misses everything. On a straight deck, the barricade would already be tearing his Panther apart, but there is no barricade, only clean deck and empty air ahead. Buell slams the throttle to full power. His J-48 engine begins to spool up in 6 seconds.
An eternity seems to pass, and yet it feels like a blessing. The Panther finally lifts off the deck. He's flying again. 23 seconds later, he's back in the landing pattern. On the second approach, he hooks the 3-wire. A flawless recovery. Buell climbs out of his cockpit trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for years. In his autobiography, he would later write that for an experienced carrier pilot, bringing a jet onto an angled deck was pure joy. For the first time in his career, he wasn't afraid that every approach might kill him. He said the psychological burden that vanished that day was a weight he never knew he had been dragging behind him. Over the next 60 days, Carrier Air Group 8 makes 1,327 landings on Antietam's angled deck. They record 8 bolters, missed wire landings that require going around. On a straight deck, 8 bolters would likely have resulted in about 5 barrier crashes, 2 destroyed aircraft, and 1 or 2 dead aviators. On the angled deck, 0 crashes, 0 wrecked aircraft, 0 injuries. The numbers speak for themselves. Before the angled deck, between 1950 and 1952, the U.S. Navy averaged 647 Class A mishaps per year, with landing accidents responsible for 52% of all losses. After angled decks were adopted, between 1955 and 1957, Class A mishaps dropped to 321 annually, and landing accidents were responsible for just 19%. That meant a 75% reduction in landing accidents and an 80% drop in barrier-related fatalities. But statistics alone don't tell the human story. Lieutenant James Davidson does. On March 8, 1953, Davidson limps his damaged Panther back to Antietam. His hydraulics are gone. He has no flaps. His approach speed is 20 knots too fast. On a straight deck, he wouldn't have attempted a landing at all. He would have ditched in the ocean rather than risk hitting a barricade at 145 knots. But Antietam has an angled deck. Davidson makes 4 approaches. He misses the wires all 4 times. On his 4th attempt, he snags the 4-wire at 142 knots, the fastest successful carrier landing ever recorded up to that moment. His aircraft comes to a halt with 11 feet of deck remaining. 6 months later, he writes to Captain Campbell, "Sir, we've never met, but I'm alive because you had an idea everyone swore was impossible. My daughter was born last month. I was there because you refused to accept that good pilots should die because of bad design. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but thank you." The British adopt angled decks on Ark Royal in 1955. The French convert Clemenceau. Australia modifies Melbourne. By 1957, every major Western Navy either has angled deck carriers in service or carriers undergoing conversion. Even the Soviets, who initially rejected the idea, quietly embraced it after a string of disastrous landing accidents aboard their straight-deck carrier Varyag in 1959. Declassified Soviet naval records from 1993 show landing mishaps fell by 68%
within 6 months of implementing the angled deck. But the most powerful testimony comes from pilots themselves. Captain John Moore, who flew combat missions over Vietnam from USS Coral Sea, wrote, "I made 947 carrier landings between 1954 and 1973. I boltered, missed every wire 62 times. On a straight deck, that's 62 chances to hit the barricade, 62 chances to die or kill the sailors working forward. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again." Every pilot my age remembers the friends we lost in the 50s to barricade crashes. We survived because Dennis Campbell drew a line on paper and wouldn't let it go. By 1955, the angled deck had become so universal that younger naval aviators grew up unaware that carriers were ever designed differently. The innovation had become invisible, just the way things worked. The revolution was complete. The angled deck saved thousands of lives, but Dennis Campbell never sought credit. What he did after the breakthrough is even more surprising. Campbell never gave a press interview about the angled deck. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1954. He attended the launch ceremony for HMS Ark Royal, the world's first carrier designed from the keel up with an angled deck. When reporters asked him for comment, he directed them instead to Louis Boddington and the engineers at Farnborough. When the U.S. Navy invited him to the commissioning of USS Forrestal in 1955, the first American supercarrier equipped with angled decks, steam catapults, and optical landing systems, Campbell politely declined the invitation.
He wasn't at the commissioning of Forrestal for one simple reason. He was attending the funeral of a Royal Navy lieutenant who'd been killed in a training accident. It wasn't even a carrier mishap. It was a helicopter crash entirely unrelated to anything Campbell had ever worked on. But the young officer had served under him back in 1943, and Campbell believed that you always showed up at the funerals of the men who served with you. Always. In 1957, the Admiralty awarded him the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, for his contributions to naval aviation. The official citation was just 2 sentences long. Campbell tucked the certificate into a drawer. He left the Royal Navy in 1960 and joined Hawker Siddeley Aviation as a technical consultant, helping develop vertical takeoff aircraft. His colleagues remembered him as relentlessly fixated on pilot safety, often slowing down design reviews by insisting on redundant systems and raising hypothetical failure scenarios many engineers considered unrealistic. Dennis would hold up every meeting, recalled engineer Anthony Marsh. He'd ask questions like, "What happens if this fails at night in bad weather?" We'd tell him the odds of that happening were 1 in 10,000. He'd respond, "What does the pilot do when he's the 1 in 10,000? He never cared about statistical likelihoods. He cared about the one unlucky pilot. Dennis Campbell died on April 6, 2000, at the age of 92. His obituary in The Times ran 4 paragraphs. The Guardian devoted 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither came close to expressing what it truly represented. Because what it meant was simple. Every carrier landing since 1953 has been possible because one naval officer refused to accept that aviators should die from preventable causes. Today, every aircraft carrier in operation, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, or Russian, uses an angled landing deck. The U.S. Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford-class carriers boast electromagnetic catapults and advanced arresting gear, but the landing area is still angled 8 degrees to port, exactly as Campbell sketched it in 1951. Modern naval aviators conduct more than 15,000 carrier landings per year in the U.S. Navy alone. The bolter rate, missed wire approaches requiring another go-around, is roughly 8%. That's about 1,200 missed wire attempts annually. Without the angled deck, Those 1,200 bolters would translate into roughly 1,200 potential barrier crashes. How many lives saved? Hundreds every year. Over 7 decades, tens of thousands. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black of the Marine Corps, who flew FA-18s from carriers between 1985 and 2007, tracked down Campbell's family in 2003 and mailed them a letter. It said, "I never met your father, but I made 147 carrier landings during my career. I boltered 142 times, missed every wire, and on a straight deck I would have been at risk of dying each time. Instead, I simply added power, climbed away, and came back around. Your father gave me 142 second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life. On behalf of every carrier pilot who survived because of him, thank you." Campbell never read that letter. He had already been gone for 3 years, but his son framed it because his father had never kept his own medals or commendations. This letter, however, was different. This one meant something. The lesson is clear. Major breakthroughs don't always originate from the recognized experts. Sometimes they come from the one person willing to question the deeply ingrained answer of, "because that's how we've always done it." Dennis Campbell was not an engineer. He was not a test pilot. He was a desk officer who couldn't ignore the deaths of people he cared about, who dared to draw a simple angled line on a sheet of paper and ask, why not? The angled deck saved more lives than any Medal of Honor recipient. It reshaped naval aviation more profoundly than nuclear propulsion or guided missiles, and it didn't emerge from committees or advanced research labs. It came from a train ride, a notebook, a rough sketch, and sheer unwillingness to remain silent when everyone else insisted the problem was unsolvable. That is the real story, and that is why it matters. Because the next Dennis Campbell may not be an admiral or an engineer or someone with the right credentials. He might be someone who sees a deadly flaw that everyone else has learned to accept and refuses to let it stand. History isn't always written by the loudest or highest-ranking voices. Sometimes it's shaped by the one person who refuses to let good people die for a bad design.